just been told that my mic is off. Now you can hear me. All right, let's start that again. All right, guys, welcome again to Elevate.Strategy Leadership Live. You'd think that after 2 years that I would know when my mic is off. So I guess I'm anticipating not using Zoom anymore, which is a very good prospect. So anyway, today we have a wonderful guest. Her name is Erin Godard, and she's a director at RBC Ventures. We'll talk about that in a second. But one thing really interesting about her is that she made a very significant career pivot point somewhere along her career journey, which I know many of you have been thinking of before, and all along, especially during COVID, having time to maybe reflect on your particular career and maybe the fact that you haven't been able to express your skills and capabilities as much or far as you would like to. This is a great opportunity to hear about her story and kind of where she came from. So thank you once again for joining us. I'm just going to introduce us to our guest. So Erin Godard is a director at RBC Ventures, leading Arrive, a program of venture tackling challenges that newcomers face. Erin started her career in public accounting at Ernst Young, focused on banking and capital markets clients. In 2017, Erin pivoted her career, co-founding a social enterprise focused on equipping the next generation of African accountants with the tools that they need to succeed, based in East Africa. Most recently, Erin has held leadership roles at startups, including Opencare and now RBC Ventures. And without further ado, I'll just bring her to the front stage. Erin?
Hi, Simeon. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks for coming on the show. Really honored and happy that you could take time and share with us and the audience about your career journey and where it took you from something that was quite stable of an accounting career into something that maybe may have been more risky, but at the same time, hopefully more rewarding. So for those of us, I guess some of your colleagues had sort of clicked like and sort of will be watching, if not post broadcast even now. Maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience. What is it that you do, and just a little bit about yourself and about RBC Ventures, obviously.
Yeah, thanks, Simeon. As you mentioned in your intro, I started my career as an accountant. So in public accounting at Ernst Young, in the financial services group, really focusing in on clients that are banking in nature, investment funds, that type of thing. So highly complex, quite risky, really interesting work. But as you mentioned, I know we'll talk a little more about that later, I did end up making a pretty significant career pivot, starting my own company back in 2017. After doing that for a couple years, ended up back in Toronto. As you mentioned, the company I founded was based in East Africa. So was living there for about 2.5, 3 years.
Wow.
Made my way back to Toronto and ended up getting into more of the startup space. So working at Opencare, which is a tech company based in Toronto, focused on the healthcare space, specifically the dental industry. And from there, made my way over to RBC Ventures, which is a really interesting concept. It's a group within RBC that goes beyond banking to build products for everyday people that have everyday problems. And ultimately, we operate with some of the same elements of startups. So moving quickly, trying new ideas, testing, failing, trying again. But with some really great support from the proper bank, as well as experts that can help us face those challenges. So it's a really interesting role that I'm in now. And as you mentioned, I do lead a venture called Arrive.
Right.
And that venture focuses in on solving problems that newcomers to Canada face. Things all the way from finding your first home in Canada that's at a reasonable price that you can afford, all the way to how to register your kids for school, getting your OHIP card, and hot topic, which is always, how do you start your career in Canada? How do you make that move to the Canadian market? So yeah, that's a little bit about me, but feel free to jump in with more questions too.
Yeah, for sure. So let me just rewind back to the beginning of your career as an accountant. And I always kind of love to move further back in that and sort of, talk about how it was in your journey that you get to the point of deciding that you wanted to do business and then you wanted to do accounting specifically. Was there anything kind of growing up that kind of instilled in you some sort of aspirational goal, or people in your life that kind of, steered you in that direction?
It's an interesting story because when I was applying for university, I kind of looked at two different paths, business and science, and they were very different. Actually ended up applying to programs in both of those fields at a number of universities, and eventually decided, hey, I'm not super sold on the science, the medicine side. Let
Hmm.
me go into something a little bit more general and see where things take me. So I ended up at McGill University, which has a great business program, very internationally focused, which was another passion of mine, which is travel and seeing the world, and ended up in the business program there. Um, really was not sure what I would do, if it would be accounting, finance, marketing. But actually, both my parents are accountants. So they were always in the background saying, if you don't really know, this is a great field to have
Right.
as a base. You learn a lot of really transferable skills. And so in third year, ended up declaring my major and did finance with a minor in accounting, or sorry, did a major in finance with a minor in accounting. And then made my way into Ernst Young right after graduating.
Right. And what was it about accounting that appealed to you? Are you a creative person, or are you kind of more logic based, kind of numbers or come alive to you kind of person?
Yeah, I'm very logic based. I do really love numbers, as nerdy as that sounds, but I've always had kind of a knack for math, numbers, problem solving. So when I think about that decision I was making between the sciences and something like business, the science that I always was really interested in was chemistry, because it's all
Mm.
about how things work together, tons of equations, tons of problem solving. And I do find the same happens in accounting and finance, but you are dealing with, that other aspect, which is the human connection, working in teams, which is something I've also always enjoyed since being a kid, and working with other people. So I did
Mhm.
feel like it fit me really nicely to be able to go into a field that does have a lot of that, working with others, working cross functionally. Um, but I was not, super passionate about accounting in particular. It just seemed like a really great skill set to learn. And I'll be honest, I think it has really served me well as I moved into roles that are beyond accounting, beyond finance. I think having that base has been really,
Mhm.
really valuable over the course of my career.
And you mentioned earlier on that the international aspect had always appealed to you. And you say that you were a traveler. And so what was it about the internet? Like, when did you get the international bug, I guess, in your system?
I've always also been a really big reader. And so I think just reading about different countries, probably in high school when I first started diving into some books about international, or things happening in other countries, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, that really stemmed the want to travel. And so did some traveling right after I graduated high school, was really fortunate to be able to do that.
Hmm.
And then when I was looking at programs, also wanted to make sure that there was the potential to do an international exchange. And so in third year, I ended up spending 6 months in Hong Kong, which was a life-changing experience. I know that
Yeah.
might be overused, but it was really, really great for me to be able to go somewhere on my own, meet a whole new group of people, and really immerse myself in a different culture.
Yeah, and Hong Kong is a great place for that, right? Because you can speak English fully and not necessarily need to. Yeah, yeah. Because I grew up there, fond memories of that particular place. Um, so you'd always read and what kind of for someone who's so numbers oriented and logic, what kind of books did you like reading growing up?
I definitely prefer the some, I would say, based in fact, in terms of happening in another country, and could be a real life story that could in fact happen, but they are not necessarily, so I guess maybe, the historical fiction types, things
Hmm.
that are, realistic. I'm not a big fantasy fan, I'll say that, but that are not happening in your personal day-to-day life. So just being able to see other parts of the world, how other people live. So that was always something I've loved, and to this day I still read quite a bit. I'm a pretty avid reader, and love to do that in my free time.
Right. So when you were in accounting, then how was that experience when you graduated, going into an accounting firm? Was it what you expected? Kind of what were some of the things that you picked up? You said now you use as well in your workplace, but overall, like, what was your experience like as an accountant?
I always say this to students, that when I'm speaking to them, I often have coffee conversations about career journeys, and I honestly did not know what to expect. And starting in the workforce you think you have an idea of what is going to happen at an established firm or a company, but really honestly, when I started, I did not actually know what to expect. And
Mhm.
I think the really interesting thing for me was I was in the audit side of public accounting. So you're basically looking at what someone else is doing, trying to replicate it, understand their logic, seeing if it makes sense to you. Um, and ultimately, I think the biggest skill that I learned there was just the ability to look at something, understand it quickly, ask a ton of questions, and then figure out how to solve that problem or how to
Right.
understand what someone else is doing. And I think that that's probably the thing that I use day to day, every day, is being able to look at a situation, understand what works, what doesn't work, where you have questions, and be able to ask those questions and then ultimately build that out to whether it's a strategy, whether it's a process, something like that. So that's probably the thing I learned the most. And all of that was based in solving for accounting problems. What should your credit loss number be? What should your prepaid balance be? All those basics that you're looking at, but
Right.
ultimately finding creative ways to replicate work others have done so that you get to the same answer or a different answer. And I think that's what I continue to come back to.
Right. Gotcha. And I think the experience in any professional services firm is very different from one person to another, right? Depending on kind of what your interest is, your personality and background. So this move to, so I'd love you to kind of share about the pivot. But before that, as you were kind of going through the accounting route, um, what did you find yourself favoring more? Like what was the aspect of, more specifically around, were you finding that you were more of a people person, a process kind of a person? Like, what was the experience like growing there to the point of where you made a decision that we'll talk about in a second?
Yeah, I think, like you said, this is something really unique to some of the big professional services firms, is that you're often given quite a lot of responsibility at a very early stage of your career. So by my second or third year working at Ernst Young, I had teams below me where I was managing as a senior accountant, younger, more junior members who are very fresh out of school. That aspect for me has always been really interesting. I've always loved working with other people, and I also really liked being able to say, as the leader of this group or team, how do all of the different things other people are doing fit into the whole
Mhm.
to actually help us achieve that objective? So,
Right.
really love the planning and the kind of organizational side of where are everyone's strengths, who has what skill set, and how do we put that together to ultimately hit, whether it's a goal from an audit perspective to hit our timelines, to hit our deadlines, or
Mhm.
now in my current role, longer term strategy to build out a business or a business unit.
Right. Gotcha. And so you'd always been fascinated by that side, but you mean people coming into their first job, or kind of what aspect of that element, or were you talking about leading a team?
Yeah, I think a couple things. Leading a team and really understanding who can do what and how that, call it, the parts are greater, or the sum of the parts is greater than just the parts on their own. And that's something that for me has always been really interesting. As soon as I started in that more managerial type role, was like, wow, as you move up and as you have a team that you're working with, you really can achieve so much more than that individual person
Right.
going, on your own. And the other thing that I really loved is also just being able to look at complex problems, seeing, there's 10 things that factor into this, and how can I therefore get to an outcome that I'm looking at? Do I need to bring in those experts that have looked at this
Hmm.
for 10, 20 years and can give me the knowledge that I need? Or is it something that one of my more junior team members could actually come in and just through hard work and attention to detail figure things out? So
Right.
I think the complexity has always been kind of exciting for me to be able to
Mhm.
say, hey, this is a really meaty challenge that I'd like to tackle, and
Right.
really bringing the right people to the table to help tackle it has been always exciting for me.
Right. Gotcha. So now let's move on to the pivot. Um, could you describe a little bit first about what that pivot was, and then
Sure.
process by which you thought through it to say, that's exactly what I want to do, and I'm going to probably take a big career switch over. So what was the pivot? What did you go into?
Yeah, so after about 5 years at EY, one of the great things about the professional services firms is you do have the opportunity to take time off, explore, do a sabbatical, really think through things. And
Mhm.
as you mentioned in your intro, sometimes when you have that downtime, that's when you can really do the self-assessment to say, am I really excited about what I do each day? Is there something else I'd like to be doing? And so, again, coming back to the whole idea of traveling and seeing the world, I decided to take a couple months off in a sabbatical and did some volunteer work based in Rwanda. And this was within an organization that is similar to Engineers Without Borders or Doctors Without Borders, but basically Accountants Without Borders, where accountants will be seconded to small not-for-profits or social enterprises and use their skill set to help push that social enterprise or not-for-profit forward. So I ended up working with a small not-for-profit based in Rwanda, just outside of the capital city. And that not-for-profit was focused on nutrition, typically for mothers with young children, and how to educate families in Rwanda to be better nourished and ultimately do that on their own without additional aid. So really interesting organization, extremely impactful. But I went in there and basically helped them set up a number of financial processes and systems, which for an accountant, even quite a junior accountant, it's quite basic. It's pretty much your bread and butter. And after doing a couple years of accounting at one of the big four, you could definitely come in and make a huge impact here. I did that for a couple months, came back to Toronto, went back into my kind of day-to-day life at EY, and something just kind of kept sticking with me there, which was, why did I travel halfway around the world to do something that, someone perhaps 20 minutes away could volunteer to do and help with, as opposed to myself, I had an incredible experience, but it just wasn't sitting with me well, that there was this need to transport talent around the world for something as kind of commoditized as accounting. And so the idea just stuck with me that, something is amiss here. There's an opportunity here. There's a problem that no one seems to be solving. Maybe I can be the one to actually do that. So to be honest, there was a lot of just thinking, considering, trying to figure out, am I really willing to quit this great job where I've got really great long-term career prospects to go start something in Rwanda where people, very much don't have much ability to pay, halfway around the world, extremely different culture. So lots of things factored in. And at the end of the day, I said, this is something I've been thinking about back of mind for 6 months now. If I don't do this now, I'm probably never going to do it. I'm going to get to a point in my life where I have a mortgage, kids, family obligations, and it won't be feasible. So it was a leap of faith, to be really honest. You've got to say, hey, is this something I personally really want to dedicate whatever percentage of my life to? And do I think that that's going to make me happy and excited? And in my case, it definitely was. So I ended up quitting my role at Ernst Young. They were very gracious and gave me the promise of, hey, if this doesn't work out, which it might not, please come back. Please let us know. We're happy to continue the conversation. And ended up founding what became a social enterprise with two facets there. The first was consulting and training. So basically working with not-for-profits, social enterprises, and for-profit companies to help them set up those financial systems, processes, fundraising, things like that. And at the same time, looking at the capacity building side, because I came back to my whole thesis was, if one person is doing this work that's a Canadian from around the world, the problem will never get solved. We need to really go back to the roots and train people so that they can do this themselves and continue building that capacity. And so over the course of a couple of years, that morphed into an education platform, which was actually pre-COVID and completely online, because we did think that that was the best way to be able to distribute at a low cost, as well as to people across the whole region of East Africa, as opposed to in-person training. And that's what that ended up morphing into, and that still exists today. It's still running right now as we speak, which is great. But we did end up, when we moved back to Toronto, closing down the consulting side of the business because it was very, very time consuming, and it was a full-time job from a consulting perspective.
Had you always thought that you would just stay there for a couple of years, or had you sort of gone out thinking that this could potentially be like the rest of your life being in that part of the world?
I wasn't sure, to be really honest. It was, there was definitely that set of cultural differences where, for a couple months, it's very easy to handle and deal with, but I wasn't sure if that was something that would be, 3 to 5 years or even longer term. And it did really depend on how things went with the business and where we saw them landing. And to be honest, once we got into this online model, the possibilities became almost endless as to where you could live and work.
Right.
And that also kind of stemmed some of the decisions to move back to Toronto, just with, family obligations and things like that that we did want to do as well.
Right. And when you decided to go to Rwanda, was there anything in particular so essentially the financial systems and the accounting piece of it was pretty much, you knew that that was going to be your bread and butter, that you knew that that was going to be something needed. Is there any particular kind of other impetus that kind of drove you to say, you were saying that, it doesn't make sense, seem to be, to have a Canadian fly across the world to do something that probably someone could do in 20 minutes, right? Drive away. So what was it that drove you to say, you know what, I'm going to go there and be that Canadian who flies across the world and build something? Like, were there other sort of areas of that part of the world where you felt that probably potentially you'd be expanding into to help out with? I guess healthcare was one of them too. You said Opencare is a healthcare piece, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been pretty interested in education, especially education as a tool to empower women. And that's something that all over the world we see as basically the biggest tool to bring you out of poverty is generally education and being able to then earn a living or a stable living. So I think for me, it was just being able to also include that social side of it, to be able to solve a problem that could really impact the next generation of people living in that region. And I always
Mm,
came back to even my own journey going into accounting, graduating from that from university. I knew that if worse comes to worse, I will always have that skill set to fall back on. And
right.
you can generally make a good living and have a nice stable life if you've got a skill set that's in demand. And for me, that just felt like something that could create more than just a business or a consulting company, and ultimately make a pretty big social impact as well,
Right.
on that next generation in the region.
Gotcha. Um, when you were there, the culture shock. Tell me a little bit about sort of what the biggest thing that you had to adjust to was in order to kind of get things done, and how did you navigate through that?
Yeah, there's some very interesting cultural differences, especially in the workplace, where, especially coming from a professional services company in
Hmm.
audit, where your job is to question, to ask, to probe. There is a really different structure there in terms of a hierarchy. And if your boss tells you to do something and you don't know how to do it, you're not going to ask and clarify. You generally will try your best to figure something out. And so there
Right.
is definitely a much more kind of hierarchical system in terms of your workforce. And that was something for me that was difficult to navigate, because
Right.
as a trainer, as someone who's coaching, you want your students, you want your mentees to ask questions, to say, hey, this doesn't make sense,
Hmm.
explain it again, explain it in a way that makes sense to me. And a lot of times students weren't really willing to do that, so you did have to really kind of probe in on a personal level, make people feel comfortable, make people not worry that, oh well, Erin's doing this training, and if my boss who's hired her understands that I didn't know these things, that
Yeah.
could mean losing my job. So it was really about creating kind of an atmosphere where people could feel free to ask questions and really learn, as opposed to needing to stay very stringent and always get the exact right answer, which was very much part of the culture when I
Right.
started.
Gotcha. And then what was the biggest lesson that you learned then throughout because you were saying earlier that you love working in teams and creating stuff together. So in that culture where there is no kind of an emphasis on team and camaraderie, that say must be a very difficult shift. But what was your biggest challenge that you had to overcome to survive there and to work there and to succeed?
I think it's just all about connections and communication. And this is something I think in this virtual digital world that sometimes does get lost. It's so much about creating that personal connection with the person that you are training, working with, trying to solve a
Right.
problem with. And I know there's different ways to do it now digitally, but whether it's on a video chat, whether it's WhatsApp messages, whether it's one-on-one in a coffee, I just can't emphasize more that really connecting with someone on a personal level just changes the relationship, changes the ability to communicate, and then go beyond that into the professional side and figure out problems together. I think that was the
Mhm.
biggest learning for me. And where I do bring that back to is now in roles where I'm looking more at product and strategy, always coming back to what does your customer actually need? What do they
Mhm.
want? What motivates them? And you find that out by talking to them, by having those deep conversations, by
Right.
probing. And again, just communication and personal connections is what I've found is so key in any type of relationship.
Right. Yeah, if anyone was watching, listening, who's had experience cross-culturally working and have experienced the same thing, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. And it's never easy switching gears at all from one culture to another. Even moving North American, like for a Canadian working in the U.S., you would think that it's not that much of a shift, but it's a huge shift in mentality. Um, so, Erin, let me ask you: did you have anyone sort of like a figure in your life that you looked up to that kind of said, like that person is really has qualities that I want to have, and kind of drove you to these kind of decisions? Because that was a pretty drastic move,
Mhm.
obviously driven by some sort of passion inside of yourself, right? To feel that there was a need there. And then also at a cost to you, right? You had to sacrifice for your career. Were there anybody who it's like sort of comes to mind that were inspirational in your life that, you read about or you knew personally?
Yeah, I think I would point to my mom as definitely being a huge inspiration. And it's interesting because when I first told her, "Hey, I've made the decision to do this," the reaction was an interesting one. But she has always, since I've been a young kid, been very involved in philanthropy, generally in Toronto, but
Mm.
looking at, especially for women, how to advance women in their career, moving them out of poverty. And that was always extremely inspiring to me. So I think some of that philanthropic and social minded side definitely came from her and seeing her throughout my childhood.
Hmm.
Um, but as I mentioned, when I said, "Hey, by the way, I'm going to, quit this really stable career and go do this," that was definitely, I think, a shock for my parents, even though they both were very supportive when it came down to it. It was at the early stage saying, well, there are other ways to make an impact. If you have a great job and earn a ton of money, you can pass that on to whatever
Right.
charity you think makes sense. And
Right.
had a lot of conversations about what is the best way to make an impact on the world, what is the best way to leave your legacy. And
Mm.
so as things moved on and as my parents saw what kind of feedback we were receiving, the traction we were gaining, I think it became really clear to them, there is a different way to do that philanthropy, that social mindedness in a way different than they had done in their careers. So it
Mm.
was definitely a little bit of a journey for them as well to see how things progressed for me over the years that I was there.
And what specifically about your personality did you feel that, contributed most to your success? Um, the team building thing is definitely one thing, but was there any kind of one particular, area that if someone were to look at you in high school and say, "Oh, I always knew that Erin was going to do that because, she's da 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 da." Is there?
I think it comes down to something that's not glamorous at all, which is just hard work and putting the hours in, putting the sweat in, putting the time in. And that is something, one of my traits that I'm personally very proud of, because I think that has got me to where I currently am in my career. I'm definitely not the smartest person, not the brightest person, but I always kind of say if I'm the hardest working person in the room, that can make up for a lot of other things. And even in
Mhm.
high school, whether it was sports, whether it was schoolwork, that was something for me that I was always willing to put in that extra kind of time and energy to try to be the best or to try to move forward what I was working on.
Right, gotcha. And so moving back to now, when you decided to come back to Toronto, um, what was the reason for that? And I guess the leading question would be, did you feel like you could still have the same impact in Rwanda, doing what you wanted to do, empowering women, or is that now shifted away from that part of the world and wanting to kind of take that same mission but keep it in Canada? Like, what prompted you to leave?
Yeah, there was definitely the personal side as well as the professional side. And I think personally, like you mentioned, it is tough to move around the world somewhere where you don't have friends, don't have family, starting up your whole network again. And it's challenging, to be very honest. It can be mentally draining. There's a lot of travel involved. If something happens at home, you're not there, you're not able to do that. So I think after about 3 years, that was one of the big decision factors, was just where do my family and friends live, and
Mm.
do I want to be able to be closer to them and be able to see them more frequently than, twice a year, for example. So that was definitely kind of there on the personal side. Um, on the professional side, myself and my co-founder felt that with the platform we developed, we could continue to service these students in the exact same way that we were doing, no matter where we were in the world. And
Right.
again, I do kind of laugh because we were completely digital, completely remote before
Before
COVID
even,
happened.
right.
And that was very much, it was stemmed, first of all, actually from a cost perspective to build out a
Mm.
platform that could be cost effective for people in that area of the world.
Right.
So we did feel like we could continue doing the program completely remotely, and at the same time felt like after doing about 3 years of consulting professionally had seen a lot, but was starting to see the same types of problems again and again, and felt like from that perspective in a career situation I wasn't getting as much exposure or as many challenges as I was when we first started the consulting side of the business back, in 2017, 2018. So was also ready for a different challenge from a professional perspective, to be able to move on. And honestly, just did not see the same kind of opportunities professionally in that region of the world. And to your point as well, at that point, it was almost saying, hey, if I've spent 3 years here and I'm going to commit to working at a company, building out something here, it's probably another 5 or 10 years time frame. And from a
Mm.
personal perspective, wasn't ready to say, hey, I'd like to live in Rwanda for another 5 or 10 years and not see family and friends in the same way.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe you will go back when you're ready to go. I have 3 kids, and obviously my wife and I have 3 kids, and it is very difficult to make any switch of any kind, major shift of any kind, when you have the responsibilities that you do, right? So, but time passes, and sometimes that mission, that passion never leaves you, in such a way that as you have these responsibilities coming on board, you still feel compelled to do something more with it, that's different than what you do now. So when you came back, was there a culture shift or culture shock to you? Like some people talk about a reverse culture shock, having to kind of
A
readjust
little bit.
things.
I think the reverse culture shock honestly came from just the difference in lifestyle. And you grow up with having pretty much everything at your fingertips without needing to worry too much about spending. I was very, very lucky to grow up and not have to worry about those kind of things. But then coming back to the country after having been kind of faced with that every single day,
Mm.
from just seeing, the people that you're interacting with and the level of spending that they are doing, coming back to Canada and just seeing, how people spent their money was a little bit shocking. And especially because I used to do that. I was
Mm.
not, and so I think that was a little bit of a reverse culture shock. Again, just continuously being reminded that we are so privileged, or at least I am so privileged with my situation in Canada and what
Mm.
I have available to me. So that was kind of constantly at the back of my mind, and honestly still is, which is, I think, what drives me to do some of the things I do in terms of philanthropy and donating money and things like that. But at the same time, you do quickly get back into the workforce, and
Hmm.
once you're back into a day-to-day, it's very easy to forget some of those lessons that you had. But
Hmm.
that was the biggest one for me, is just the constant reminder of, I am so privileged. I've had such a privileged life, and just constantly looking at ways to be able to try to share that in whatever way possible.
Right. And you started off at Opencare when you came back. Is that what you
Yeah,
went?
when I came back, I definitely wanted a new challenge from a career perspective, but I also knew that I wanted something that was hopefully fast moving, hopefully in that startup space. Having
Hmm.
done that myself, knew that I didn't want to go back straight away to a big company that was very well established. I did like having those, fires that come up every day that you figure out and you put out, and then you move on to something new and exciting. And one of those hypotheses I had about myself was, hey, maybe healthcare is actually another area that
Mm.
I could be super excited, really passionate about. And so went into Opencare, which, as I mentioned, they are in the health industry, but ultimately focused very much on the dental space. And that
Mhm.
was In the long run, not necessarily something that I felt extremely passionate about.
Right. Right.
Really incredible experience. Like, I learned so much in the time there that
Mm-hmm.
has been extremely valuable, but got to a very similar point at Opencare, which was, okay, if I do really want to excel in this industry, it's going to be 5-10 year journey, and do I want to be an expert in the dental space? And ultimately, for me, that was a no, and that's how I started kind of looking for other options and other things, which led me to my current role at RBC Ventures.
Right. Right. And we'll move there now. So you went to RBC Ventures. What was it about the mission that really, I guess a bit of a leading question, but what was it about it that really attracted you in to say, you know what, this is going to be probably up my alley and similar to the passions that I have? Like what you could be, because now you're in a big company, right?
Yep.
The very thing
Yeah.
you didn't want to go straight into after you came back.
Yeah, I think I ended up, I wasn't really looking for a role, but had started that kind of discovery phase of what interesting companies are out there, what
Right.
companies have maybe innovation groups that are looking at doing different things in different ways. And a friend of mine from university was actually at RBC Ventures, and we just had a quick chat and we're catching up. And she said, there's a couple roles open. Take a look, see what you think. Let me know if you'd like to be connected. So as I started digging around, I did see that there are a couple ventures at RBC Ventures that have those very exciting, or for me are very exciting missions. For others, perhaps not. But Arrive is definitely one of them, where we look at newcomers as the next generation of Canadians that are going to ultimately shape the country, shape our economy for years to come.
Right.
And again, loving the travel aspect, loving the meeting new people aspect, for me, this seemed like a really interesting fit, just knowing the struggles that newcomers do face when they get to the country. And
Right.
so to me, it almost was just, I hate to say, like a perfect mix of,
Yep.
hey, there's a
Yep.
social mission here that I can really get excited about. There is that big company set of resources and expertise that I can dive into. And then
Right.
there's also the, call it like anonymity, to be able to do things quickly, move quickly, pivot if we need to, very
Right.
similar to a startup. So I honestly was like, oh, this seems too good to be true. Is this a real job?
Right.
And it was true. So that's great. And obviously then went through the interview process, spoke to a number of people within Ventures and also within the Arrive team at Ventures, who were very similar minded, had that big passion for helping people, but also really excited about making a sustainable business and building something from the ground up.
Right. Erin, one of the things that I really appreciate about you is your constant theme about the immigrants being the shaping of the future of Canada. I wanted to ask you, because a lot of my clients are actually from some of the further countries who are looking to move to different places. Either they're trying to transition to another company in the same country, or they're trying to move out. What are some of the qualities that you would say that a new immigrant coming into Canada would need to have in order to be successful and sort of be a change maker?
I think the perseverance side
Right.
is one thing that it's tough to articulate, but it's challenging. To your point, it's very hard. No matter where you're moving, what your background is, there are going to be challenges to overcome. And just keeping at the back of your mind that if you persevere, good things will happen. Things will, doors will open, but you're going to need to have that perseverance. And I
Mhm.
think just openness to change, openness to see things differently. That's something that I think will take people very far, just because everyone around the world does things differently. We've got a ton of similarities, and if you're open, you can find those similarities amongst the differences. And I think openness is another big one, that a lot of newcomers who are successful have been very open to new ideas, different types of roles than they might have had in the past, something
Mhm.
that looks a little bit different from what they did in their home country. So I'd say that would be another one to really keep top of mind as a newcomer coming to the country.
Right. Gotcha. And I think the 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 mix of the different cultures coming into Canada can also help shape a lot of the ways that we do things that we sort of taken for granted as being that's the only way to do things, which actually tends to be quite rigid in North America, right? Because we have everything in place, so we don't have to kind of ad hoc, find something flexible to get things done, right? So that's great. So do you have any thoughts around how you could transplant some of the things that you've learned here from Opencare, from RBC Ventures to back to somewhere like East Africa?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And that's something I think down like further on in my career, I absolutely love to come back to. And perhaps that's in a very different way. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is not actually taking like a managerial role or a
Mhm.
day-to-day role, but being able to be perhaps on a board or an advisor to
Right.
um, and there are so many innovative companies that are based in Kenya, Rwanda, as well as West Africa, which I'm not as familiar with, but they could absolutely benefit to have someone that comes in, once a month to bounce ideas off of from a
Hmm.
finance, controls, governance
Right.
perspective.
Right.
So that's something that I've been thinking a lot about is when is the right time for me to do something like that? When will I have this skill set that I can really come in and add a lot of value to folks that are building these businesses on the ground in these countries?
Hmm.
But it's definitely something I'm very interested in and would love to get more involved in when the timing is right.
Right. So before I move to the rapid fire questions, which is the end of our interview, one more question about your personal struggles. So as you've kind of progressed through your career, as it pertains to career, as you kind of uh, progressed through your career, what were some of the times where it was very difficult to make career decisions, or you had to sort of slog through something that was in a job and kind of, that had maybe significant implications on the kind of direction that project went, or something that had to do with your development? And how did you get through those tough times?
I think one of the tough times for me was definitely in this, call it transitional period, when I had come back from that secondment, had a day to day job with responsibilities, a team, but
Mm,
my head was perhaps somewhere else in terms of big goals and exciting plans that I was hoping to move on towards. And
right.
um, it was challenging because you've got a reputation you have, built up for yourself, and to leave 3 months later and have ruined 5-6 years worth of developing a reputation is definitely what I did not want to do.
Mm,
And I think ultimately that pushed me to make the decision I ended up making, which was, hey, this is the right time for me to move on to something else. And
mm,
it was challenging because, like you said, it was a big decision, like no salary, moving to a new country, a number of expenses, and ultimately this could be something that does not push me forward in my career. It could actually be something that could be seen as a negative.
mhm,
And so
mhm.
ultimately just did a bit of, I don't want to say soul searching, but really deep down saying, hey, what is important to me? And am I willing to take this risk? If I'm not, I need to move on and do something else. And if I
Right.
am, I need to just go 100% in. And that's probably advice I would give to other entrepreneurs or people that are looking to start businesses. It's so tough to do more than one thing at 120%. And
Yeah. Right.
you have to be honest with yourself about what you can and can't do. And for
Right.
me, I was honest with myself. Hey, I can't do my demanding job at a professional services firm and build a business on the side. I need to
Yeah.
pick where I'm going to go. And um, that was probably one of the challenging times for me, is just because of my head was in two different places and I was really trying to suss
Right.
out, hey, what is the right way to go?
Right. Yeah. And when your back is against the wall and you're eating what you hunt, or something like that,
Yeah.
you have no choice. You have no paycheck to lie back to sort of fall back on. That's when you make the most creative and crazy decisions, right? Many of which actually stick, and you didn't really even realize that. And just the tough learning of entrepreneurship is incredible, right? At the same time, very scary. So, but I really do applaud you for that. And I'm working alongside with you now, and I see a lot of the compassion that comes from working in a different culture showing up in the way that you work. And so that's something that I think is also very important, is for people to have that degree of empathy and compassion for others, right? Even in especially in the corporate world as well. So, and that's something I try to emphasize a lot for my clients with, is whether you're new immigrants or whether you're here already, is that it's not just about you, right? It's not just about kind of developing yourself, but it's also about what do you do with what you've been gifted with and what you've learned, right? And so that's why I love your story. So All right, Erin, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for your time. Now, before you go, I have some rapid fire questions for you. I don't know if you've seen any of the interviews, but they're the same all the time.
Okay.
So number one is, what is your alter ego profession? If you weren't doing what you're doing now, what would you do?
I would definitely be a travel photographer.
Okay. So photography is one of your things too?
Very, very basic, but I do love traveling. I love taking pictures and exploring new places. So for me, if I, could have that dream job that's completely outside of corporate, it would be traveling, finding new places, and perhaps writing and taking photographs to supplement that.
And you mentioned that you read a lot of books, which is very helpful for this question. So what's the title of one book or one movie that would best describe you, either yourself or your career?
Oh, this is a tough one.
There's too
um,
many.
oh, okay. Well, maybe I start with my favorite book of all time is A Fine Balance, which is one of the ones that pushed me to just, you know, go travel, learn about new cultures. Um, Maybe the title kind of describes me in that I do balance a lot of things. There's a lot of aspects about myself that perhaps might be counterintuitive, like an accountant who's very business minded, very logical and strategic, but also have that kind of social enterprise mindset. The idea of helping people has always been really big for me. So maybe I use the title as, hey, like the fine balance between all these different aspects of me. But that's definitely
Mhm.
my favorite book. I think I've read it 4 or 5 times at this point, and it's one of the ones that really inspired me to just see beyond my own day-to-day
Mm.
world.
I've never heard of that. Who's the author?
It's Rohinton Mystery.
Okay.
He's an
Okay.
Indian author. I think he lives in Brampton now in the GTA region.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Um, that very aptly describes everything that you've talked about today. Okay, great. Erin, what is one word that you love?
Oh, geez. I these are tough questions. One word I love is process, which is very typical for like an accountant, someone who's very driven
Uh-huh.
to look at
Yes.
process. But for me, I love that idea of just having steps to follow and knowing that you're going to get to that outcome. So not a super exciting one, but one that I probably use 5, 10 times a day just because it comes
Okay.
up so frequently.
Okay. Yeah, that's very exciting. I mean, it can be a really exciting process. So, uh, good on you. All right. Um, so what's one word that you hate? Okay.
Um,
No
one that
process.
oh geez, one that I hate, or that perhaps is just overused, is collaboration or collaborative or collaborate. And I think people sometimes throw that in there to say, hey, like let's collaborate. This can be a collaborative process, as opposed to actually thinking about, hey, who should be doing what and how should we be doing this. So just very recently, I've definitely heard that word a ton of times, and it can be very meaningless if you're just throwing it out there all the time. So that's one that
Mhm.
I wouldn't say I hate it, but that I do feel is a little bit overused, especially of recent times. I've heard it a lot.
Right. And it's ironic because that's one of the things that you love to do is in your definition of collaboration, collaborate with the team to make the team greater than the sum of its parts, right? As you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, last one. What's one COVID hobby or habit that you developed?
One great habit that I've developed is a lot of walking, and just being able to disconnect from the screen or whatever it is. So at the beginning of COVID, when everything was shut down, gyms were closed.
Mm,
It was like, hey, what can we do? And so
yeah.
ended up just finding a couple podcasts that I had not had a chance to catch up on in day-to-day life, and taking long walks every morning, which honestly now I really don't want to give that up. It's something that I found has
Yeah.
been almost like meditative in terms of getting the fresh air. Even seeing the seasons change outside has been really nice to do it in that way. So that's
Mhm.
something, it's a great habit I think that I've picked up on. And
Right.
I've tried a couple hobbies. None of them have stuck as much as that. And just being able to get out in the fresh air, take some time to yourself without, other things that are plaguing your mind, and just sometimes let your mind wander into some of your best thinking happens then when you're just, out by
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Well, Erin, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate hearing about your story, and I hope that listeners have been inspired. You are a very level-headed person. You sound very level-headed, which is rare in my world of watching entrepreneurs work, because oftentimes entrepreneurs can be quite up and down as far as their mood swings go, and I'm sure you have your times as well. But it just goes to show that doing a pivot doesn't require you to be a certain kind of person all the time, and that's one of the myths, right? That people will say, "I'm not like that. I'm not like a huge." I mean, if there's anyone who's the least risk taker in my circle of friends, it's accountants, and
And
and so
I
it's
would say that's exactly it, Simeon, is, you know, you don't have to have a certain experience or a certain background to make that pivot. And to your point, accountants are very risk averse. That's why I went into the field. I was like, this is a great, stable profession.
right,
Um,
right.
and yes, some of the risks I took were very calculated, but other ones you could not possibly, calculate or figure out. So
Right.
I think that's great advice that you said. Like, you don't need to be a certain type of person, have a certain education or a certain background to go out and make a bold move. And you
Yeah.
can do it in ways that you also still feel comfortable with, whether
Mhm.
it's, you know, having a partner or a family member that you can rely on for advice and for
Right.
guidance, or, all those types of things. So I think it's a really great advice that you give to your audience.
Well, it all came from you, so thank you so much, Erin. And I'll talk to you soon. Don't go anywhere yet. I'll just put you backstage, and then we'll
Perfect.
wrap up together afterwards. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you.
Another really awesome interview, and really thankful to Erin for sharing her story with us. Um, I would really encourage you to check out RBC Ventures. It's a really, really interesting and really, I think, groundbreaking program from Royal Bank of Canada, especially if you're in Canada. And yeah, RBC Ventures, check them out, especially the Arrive program. And I've been involved with them for a little bit of time now. And especially if you're a new immigrant, particularly the case. They really do a great job in covering a 360 of what it takes for a human being to live, especially in a new place. So thank you so much, guys, for listening, watching. Again, if you have any questions or if you want to reach out to Erin, feel free to reach out to her on LinkedIn. I'm sure she'll be more than happy to connect. All right. So until next time,